Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Uh, I'm so delighted to welcome everyone to this public lecture by Professor Dr. Stefan Weishaar from Groningen University. So today, I would also like to welcome participants from the Zoom meeting. Welcome to this guest lecture. So today we will be speaking about carbon emission trading, one of the tool to mitigate climate change. Many of us perhaps already um, talk about this in previous courses, in previous meetings, in climate law courses. And today we will delve deeper into this particular tool called emission trading. So we will see the rationale behind this, and then Professor Stefan will, of course, tell us about a little bit about the carbon tax and the options of trading and how the European Union finally choose the trading scheme instead of the tax. So, Professor, just to introduce you briefly, so Professor Dr. Stefan Weishaar is a professor of law and economics from the Netherlands in Groningen University. And today he will be speaking, of course, about the carbon trading scheme. Without further ado, I'll give the floor to Professor Stefan. Time is yours.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction. And indeed, I would like to talk about carbon emissions trading systems. And I will also talk a little bit about the similarities and differences in the approach to taxation. Why, you might ask, is this relevant? Well, I also have been able to be appointed as adjunct professor at your faculty over here on taxation and fiscal administration. And they have been working together with the government on designing the carbon tax system in Indonesia. It's not yet law, but it is at advanced stages of deliberation. And rumors have it that if it comes, it might even come quickly. And it is a combination, so it appears, between, on the one side, tax law, so fiscal instruments, and emissions trading systems. And as an institution with prominent scholars, such as Andri or Michael Faure, who champion law and economics, you already are wary about this kind of development. Why on earth do we need two systems that do similar things if you can achieve the same thing with just one instrument? Well, I'm not an expert in Indonesian law. I do not know the details of the legislation. I have been talking in South Africa to the designer of the ministry who is responsible for the legislation. He was kindly taking the time to explain me the reason and motivation and the legislation. But my knowledge was not advanced enough to understand all the idiosyncrasies and the reasoning behind. So I would very much like to study the law a little bit more to better understand the motivation of why we have two instruments that normally you would like to try to avoid to do one thing only, because you just end up with basically double the transaction costs. So, without further ado, please allow me to take a look at the agenda. What we are trying to do is first create a baseline, some knowledge about where we are in climate change, why we are all sitting in the same boat, why we should care. Then we will brainstorm, discuss the nature of the problem. How do we approach this from a law and economics perspective? Subsequently, we will be showing you some comics, and knowing Prof. Andre, you are very well advanced in, or at least used to look at these graphs. So I'm very happy to have you in the audience because I can speak off the cuffs. And if you have questions, please don't hesitate, just shoot, because we have enough time to address and make sure that I explain myself properly. So when we talk of instruments, we look at taxation. We will go through Pigouvian taxes to Baumol and Olds approaches in uniform taxes, and of course, emissions trading. We will also look at the relevance of elasticities, because when we fiddle around with prices, we create a cost shock for industry, and we need to look at what kind of effects this has for society, particularly in jurisdictions where you have members of society that are economically more challenged than others. Elasticity is very, very important, no? Because when you are engaging in carbon pricing, in whatever form, be it ETS or be it a tax system, you're creating a cost shock for industry, for power generations. Basically, you make it more expensive. And in particular, energy is very inelastic. It means that you will create a substantial regressive effect, hitting the most disadvantaged members, households of society the most. We need to understand this in order to be able to design good policies. Then subsequently, we will look at the European experience, and we will figure out that a lot of things are not gold that are shiny in Europe, because we have a rich experience of what not to do in the area of climate change. And that is what, of course, I'm here to share with you. So, climate change, where are we? This, ladies and gentlemen, is a wonderful picture. It shows us from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution how emissions were increasing. Here, it started slowly with industrialization. But it's really after the 1950s that something is happening. And what we see is skyrocketing emissions. We also see that the European share of emissions on the global scale are decreasing rapidly. In the 1990s, Europe was really an important player in terms of climate change, responsible for 17% of the emissions. Now we are at 7.4%. You might say it's like, yeah, because the others have been increasing. That is true. But the European Union has also been reducing emissions quite considerably. If we look from the 1990s till 2020, reducing by nearly 29%. When you find this graph scary, take a look at this one. This shows you the growth rates. And the black bars in the various histograms is sort of the moving average. And what you see is that the black bars are getting higher and higher, which tells you one thing, namely that we are emitting greenhouse gases more quickly, ever more quickly than before. This should at least be rather surprising, because you all have heard of the Kyoto Protocol. You all have heard that in 2015, there was something hailed as the Paris Agreement. Now we are going to turn the ship around. Now we are doing something about climate change. Do we? Do we see this? We did not see it here. We don't see it there. What do we see here? Here we see where the problem actually lies. Namely, in the increasing concentrations of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere, called parts per million, looking at how many tons of CO2 are actually in the air. And we see that we are increasing this number rather quickly. And that is a big problem, because 1 ton of CO2 has a climate change potential that is there unabated for at least 100 years before the climate change potential is actually slowly starting to decrease. So when we want to fix the environment of the globe, we are dealing with a very static, very slowly responding system. Right? It's like trying to move around an aircraft carrier. We turn the wheel now, miles down the road, we slowly start to turn. So if we want to move, we rather need to move drastically and quickly. Why do we have this problem? Well, let us look from an economic perspective at a baby in a bathtub. We are having the situation that we are opening the faucet, more water is coming in, much more than is coming out at the other end. And as a consequence, the stock, the level of the water in the bathtub will rise. And the same we have at the moment when we look at where we are with climate change and the greenhouse gas effect on the Earth. Because what is happening is that we are burning too many fossil fuels, creating too much problems, and the natural tendencies of the oceans, of stones, of wildlife to absorb the CO2 is simply completely outclassed and outmatched. And as a consequence, we have a lot of problems. What is the nature of the problem? Where are we today? Well, we are on the highway to climate hell with our foot on the accelerator, at least according to Antonio Guterres, who is the United Nations Secretary General. So he tells us we have a big problem. We are currently on a trajectory of increasing global temperatures between 2.6 and 3.1 degrees centigrade. That's too much, because according to the Paris Agreement, we just want to have 1.5, maximum 2 degrees. So we are clearly not doing well. And there's other problems, because even at current climate change levels, at current temperature increases, and now we are at 1.4, so basically 1.5 is that close away. We already have tipping points that are materializing. So basically, there has been and there is always a lot of scientific uncertainty, and the scientists have been getting it wrong. So 1.5 degrees centigrade is not the safest bet. So basically, we really need to do substantially more and quickly. We must increase our ambition levels dramatically and reduce emissions by 57% in the next 10 years globally. And to give you an image of this problem, even if everybody in good old Europe would stop breathing, that would not be the solution. So we are really sitting in the same boat, and we need to do something collectively. Now, after scaring you so much, let us take a step further and see what we can do about this. How do we approach this? How can we look at this from a law and economics perspective? Could we just argue, I did not know? No. Why not? Do you know about climate change? When have you been hearing this the first time? Elementary school. So you were already waking up to this insight. Yes. Me too. Yes. But even your parents knew about this, or could have been knowing. Even your grandparents could have been knowing about this, because scientists have been warning us already more than 130 years ago. At least our politicians, they should have been aware of this. They did not care to listen for a very long time. Well, in the 1980s, things were really starting. We had then the Toronto Conference, we had the forming of the United Framework Convention on Climate Change, we had the definition of what is sustainable the Rio conference in 92. So we had activities. We even had the Kyoto Protocol, a top-down approach of the international community where a coalition of the willing, selected member states of developed countries agreed to significantly reduce carbon emissions. Significantly, ladies and gentlemen, is minus 4.7% on average. In the period 2008-2012, below 1919 levels. What was happening? Of course, until this period, from the Kyoto Protocol, once it was signed, took many years before it could enter into force, but eventually did. But in this period, the GDP growth, economic growth, was not decoupled from carbon emissions. So emissions were allowed to rise, and people said, but it's not a problem because in a couple of years' time, we'll reduce it again. Not good arguments, right? But that is what happened. So the decoupling was not happening, and it was happening too late. Economic growth in many jurisdictions is still tightly linked with fossil fuel consumption. The Kyoto Protocol was a top-down approach. In the international community, individual nation states had to agree with each other how much they would be doing. And one country only likes to agree to something if the other one does the same. So it was really a top-down approach. We agree, and then everybody implements. That did not really work. So we had the first period, the second period, where the commitments went towards, I think, minus 18%, so a quantum leap already, bearing tribute to the dramatic story we have been listening in part one. And then in 2015, in France, we have the Paris Agreement, where we agreed to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade, maximum 2. And for the first time, we actually start with an objective. Where do we want to be? Rather, what A or B needs to do. So it's revolutionary because we have two things. One, an objective that mankind wants to attain. We have an agreement for everybody, point one. Point two, we say that everybody needs to do his homework according to common but differentiated responsibilities. Every nation decides for himself or herself how much they think they can do, but they need to have a plan. And then every couple of years, every 5 years, we engage into a stocktake and see where we are. We also inscribed in the Paris Agreement that the global emissions need to peak as soon as possible. And afterwards, we need rapid, continuous reductions. So we have a bottom-up approach where countries first were independently determining what they could be doing. Once the Paris Agreement was signed and entered into force, then they became nationally determined contributions. And every couple of years, there's a new stocktake. We always have the meetings of the parties from the United Framework Convention on Climate Change. This year, starting soon in Brazil in Belém, in which Indonesia will also table its new objectives for the period 2030-35. So we perhaps may hear that the carbon taxation and emissions trading system will then perhaps be implemented around this period of time. Maybe currently they're withholding their decision because they want to use it as a bargaining chip at these international negotiations. Could be making intuitive sense. Importantly, in this Paris Agreement, we also create a lot of transparency. We report, we make transparent to everybody in the world to see what each nation is doing. What are then the climate change consequences? Well, the good thing about climate change is that it is quite democratic. It is democratic yeah, I know it's funny, right? But it affects everybody. And we need to understand this because it affects the rich and the poor, people in nearly all parts of the world in one way or another. So it is democratic, and it means that we are all sitting in the same boat, but we are all affected, not equally, of course, quite differently. If you're living on an island state and your island disappears, or you happen to live like us in the city of Groningen in the Netherlands, we live 2 meters under the waterline. Like, where do we go when the water is swimming? We just have one mountain somewhere close, and it's not a mountain, it's just a small hill, and it's occupied by the municipality building. So all the city will run there, and still we might have a problem, right? So there are areas that are affected very differently from climate change. But we have deforestation, sea level rises, spreading wars and water conflicts, decreasing crop yields, so a lot more diseases, fisheries will be affected, a lot of global changes that are directly the result of climate change. So it's clear that we all need to work together and do something. So bottom line, we know that we need to move. We now have a clearly determined target. So why is it still so difficult to take climate action? We know we need to do something. Why don't we? Maybe we can ask a comedian, and he will tell us the following. Why should I do something to save the future? What has it ever been doing for me? Why do you want to save the world for your grandchildren? You don't know them. Maybe they are naughty. Maybe you don't even want children. Why should you forego your honeymoon in the Caribbean? Why should you forego your honeymoon on the Bahamas? It's your responsibility.
Yes, it's our responsibility and the responsibility of the law.
Yeah.
Are given something, if you're lended something, for example, you're lended a book from library, it is your duty to keep it as pristinely as possible. So I think it might be similar to our earth.
Yes.
You are lended or given to it by God or your ancestors. If you believe in God, of course, you were given to it. You were asked to manage it, and you have to keep it as pristinely as possible so that those who may get it in the future might benefit from that pristine condition.
Yes, I think you are absolutely right. But the question is, how far can you push the line of argumentation? Very far, yeah. Have you ever tried Indonesian food? Is it delicious? It's amazing, isn't it?
It's subjective, but I like soto Betawi.
Ah, yeah. But does it contain meat?
Meat,
Meat?
yes.
Oh.
Meat as in cow meat.
For example, cow meat.
Yeah.
It
Depends on the
does. You know, cows
I don't know cow.
are huge producers of methane. It comes out in the back, but in particular at the other end, in the front. Lots of it. It's bad for the environment.
Okay.
So next time you order, think about your choices. You see, suddenly it becomes personal. A honeymoon is still far away, potentially, right? But your evening dinner is just hours away.
Minutes even.
Minutes? Yes, I'm sorry. Yes, thank you for pointing this out. I'm in between your happiness. I'm sorry.
No.
But no. But it's a true point. Let's speed up. But basically, as soon as changes become personal, and you see others flying around the globe, you ask the question, what is my contribution worth? What is it that my restriction will change? And then nobody is behaving when it asks you to do sacrifices, right?
Is it similar to where there's a sign that says do not litter on the park? However, everyone else but you litters on the park, and then you say, what's the point in me keeping my trash on the pocket and carrying it heavily down the street?
Correct. That is part of the problem, right? Because we need to understand that you and me, we cause climate change. We can point to our ancestors and say it's their fault, but they are dead.
Yeah, 6 feet under.
Yeah, I mean, it does not help to blame them. It's not solving our problem, right?
Right.
I mean, we will suffer, and it's also an important insight. Before, it was always like our grandchildren. I can tell you, it's not anymore about them. It's about you and me today, because we experience climate change. We are now undergoing the tipping points, right? It's real. It is happening today, right?
Right.
So it's a problem. So how do we approach this? Because from an economic perspective, we can identify the following concept: a collective action problem. No? Olson is reminding us that individual rationality does not necessarily result in group rationality, as members of a group may have conflicting interests that do not represent the best interest of the overall group, right? And let's be clear, the average Indonesian is not the main contributor to climate change. It's also not the average European, but it's the rich people that are responsible in the various jurisdictions that are contributing massively to climate change, because they have their own air force at home, right? They eat lots of meat, and they don't even manage to finish their plate, and they don't care, right? So we can describe this as a collective action problem and ask, how do we get the people moving? Yeah, that's one approach. Another approach is to look at it through the glasses of Gareth Hardin, who was telling us about the tragedy of the commons and the fact that we need property rights to overcome the challenge of free riding, right? Because he is explaining how individual irrationality or individual rationality, incentive-based behavior, working positively for an individual can lead to major problems for society and collectively making everybody, including the farmer in his examples, worse off, right? Until virtually it's too late. So how do we overcome this free riding problem? And we have just been elucidated with a very nice example. If everybody litters the park, why would you torture yourself in carrying your rubbish home if you see everybody misbehaving? We are all human beings. It takes a lot of discipline and conviction to do the right thing. When we talk of property rights, we can also take a look at Ronald Coase. And here I would like to point out, as I normally do to my Dutch students, that his name rhymes with doos. My Dutch students like to pronounce him Ronald Coase, which is not rhyming with doos. But I think if you are winning a Nobel Prize, we can make the effort to pronounce your name properly. So what did Ronald Coase tell us? He told us that legislation is not quite as relevant. What is relevant for solving problems are property rights and, importantly, low transaction costs. Because He was explaining that if transaction costs are zero or sufficiently low, an optimal allocation of resources will follow, no matter what the legal rule actually specifies. Because independent of what the law is saying, individuals that are allowed to negotiate, to barter, to solve the problems by themselves, they can resolve them. Huh? Just let people be. And this insight is very important because it translates the challenge at hand into the government task to lower transaction costs, not to solve the problem of climate change, but to help people to address environmental problems by themselves through simple forms of negotiations. Now I can see you thinking like, okay, so how does that work in practice? Huh? I just knock at the door of a polluting factory and say, would you please like to stop doing what you're doing? Yeah, we could try that. You probably will be shoved out of the premises before you can count till 4. So why does cause not work in climate-related issues? It is very beautiful, but it's not practical in many situations, because transaction costs will effectively undermine the working of cause if they are high. So cause only works if transaction costs are low, but transaction costs are high if there are many, and unknown polluters. They will also be high when it's difficult to establish the causality between the cause and the damage, or when there is no direct relation between the polluter and the victim. Just imagine a victim of climate change in an island in the Indo-Pacific. Who's responsible? Did they cause climate change? A subsistence farmer there? Probably not. Who is responsible? Maybe a large corporation somewhere in the sense of Europe, right? How do they sue them? Very difficult. How do they prove that they are responsible for the storm that was coming and destroying their livelihood? So transaction costs can be high in many situations in relation to climate change. And those are then the situations where we need to rely more on liability rules and less on the cause theorem. But even then, we have a problem when we do not know what the exact value of the damage is that we want to deter, because the value of the damage is more difficult to determine if it is not monetary in nature. Here we see victims of the Exxon Valdez. That was a large ship creating a massive oil spill, destroying the livelihood of many fishermen. Sure, it was giving them employment to clean up beach areas. It was killing many seabirds and other mammals. The question is, what is the value of the environmental damage? Is it the market value, or does nature have a price by itself?
Hard to pinpoint. For example, animals, let's say, some might argue that, oh, let's price the animals as much as collectors would value each one bulk. However, it is still a subjective matter, as some people would argue that, oh, this animal is beautiful, let's price it higher. So, some animal is quite, sorry to say, not good looking, so you value it a bit low. And people might be subjective. For example, gold can be defined as how useful it is, but animals, wildlife, biodiversity, it's a bit subjective. So I think I agree with you that it's hard to, come up with a good price for it.
Yeah, but it goes even one step further, because here we are supposing that we can clean up. But I ask you, where do we find a second Earth to purchase? Once it's broken, where do we go? Right? Kind of difficult. And when we look at climate change, the effects that we do today will be with us for 100 years before they even get reduced. Right? So the problem that we're causing today will affect a lot of people at a point in time that we are not around. We cannot change our action anymore, just as our great-grandparents cannot change their activity, right? And as a consequence, it's really difficult to determine the price and cause of action, because economically, in our models, we just put a number and then we have a result. But if we look at the price of 1 ton of carbon emitted today, what should it be? Don't worry, there are wise guys like Stern and others that came up with a report, and they have huge figures, like 1 ton of CO2 at this point in time, at least $100, at that point in time, a bit higher. Yeah, but it's all guesswork, right? It's, yeah, not very exact, to say the least, because it cannot be. No, economists struggle with this. But let's go a step further. Let's think of how we conceptualize the problems from a traditional law and economics perspective. Well, the obvious answer is Arthur Cecil Pigou, another wise guy long dead in the 1920s, was writing The Economics of Welfare. And what he was telling us is that we simply need to internalize the externality via an optimal tax rate. As easy as that. Now, if we do this, the problem will be solved. How does this look? Well, very straightforward. We have the typical suspect. We have a price over here. We have quantity over here. We do have a downward sloping demand curve. We have an upward sloping marginal private cost curve and social costs, right? And because there's a difference between the social costs and the private costs, we have a situation where there is overproduction, overconsumption, and a too low price for what is actually good for society. So this creates the triangle here called a deadweight loss. And this is the problem we want to address and what we want to get rid of. As easy as this. So basically, when you want to save the world, one thing that you need to do is to make sure that we are paying more for energy, more for electricity. Straightforward, right? I'm standing between you and your dinner. Take this as homework. Try to explain to your parents, to your mother and father, that they should be happy to pay more for energy. If you're able to succeed to explain this and go to bed with your dessert, I will be insanely proud. But in most cases, the average citizen will say, I'm not stupid, I want low energy prices. Obviously, we all love when things are low, right? And this comes then back to the conviction, do we want to pay more? Do we want to restrict our lives? We don't, but this is precisely the beautiful solution of an environmental tax, a way to internalize externalities. And that brings us to topic 3, instruments, taxes, and ETSs. Maybe we start with a general overview. Taxation is a capable instrument. It has been employed by many jurisdictions. Here we have a map of the World Bank, and they were counting 43 taxation instruments, carbon taxation instruments around the globe. And we also have 37 emission trading systems that are implemented at this stage. So we see that many jurisdictions are working on addressing climate change through financial market-based instruments. So this is a real thing that people are doing, benevolent governments at its work. So What Arthur Cecil Pigou is telling us is that we should simply internalize the externality and put a price on each ton of carbon emissions that we are generating. And this is precisely what we are seeing in this graph. We still have price on one axis and quantity on the other. We have a difference between private marginal cost, the lower line here, and the social marginal costs. And the orange area represents the taxation, the externality that we would like to reduce. How do we do this? By simply addressing it in the form of taxation, to make sure that the private individual recognizes the societal costs as his own costs and act in accordance with what is good for society. Now, how do we internalize externalities? There are two important differences. When we are tasked to internalize externalities, we can use taxation. What we are doing there is we increase the price to such a degree that we are able to reach this point here, point M. That is where we would like to end up. So from our initial market equilibrium, we have a price of 50. If we increase the price towards 60, we automatically end up at this intersection with the demand curve. That is price-based. In the alternative, we can also say, okay, we are now at point R. We have at the moment 250 units of output, and we have a problem. We can also try to reduce the amount of output that we are allowed to produce, and we end up at point M. So in one way, we can use instruments to increase price, taxation instruments, or we can use instruments to reduce the quantity, for example, via emissions trading systems. Both are valid approaches, but they differ considerably. Because if we are approaching the problem via price, we know the price, but we don't know the environmental impact. We don't know what quantity does, because we are not aware of the precise reaction of financial incentives on companies. On the other hand, if we are addressing quantity, we don't know how the price will respond. We can change the quantity, but what happens with the price, we don't know. So we can choose either or. And curiously enough, Indonesia tries both. So I'm sorry, it's my ignorance. I'm still trying to get my head around, but it's in the law. Yeah.
There's a presidential regulation. I just got it here, issued by the president, I think yesterday, saying that exactly what you say, that we apply both tax law, carbon tax, and emission trading. It's in the new regulation.
Yes. So it's curious for me, but I just like to point this out because we are trying to sort of find a middle ground here, and I'm still looking forward to discuss with you and to learn about the details. But bear with me. So either we deal with the price and don't know what we get out in terms of environmental protection, or we get what we want immediately in terms of environmental protection, but we don't know what happens with the price. Two different approaches. Let us take a look at Pigouvian taxes very quickly, because I understand that you're already familiar with this. So here, basically, we see again our typical graph, price, quantity, downward sloping demand curve, and we see the difference between private costs and social costs. What we are worrying about is the orange area, because the orange area represents the deadweight loss in terms of environmental degradation for society. This is what we want to get rid of. But if we increase the price from 50 to 60, we also get rid of the yellow area. But the yellow area constitutes at the same time that it stands for consumer surplus and consumer and producer surplus, or at least parts of this, it also is at the same time a detriment to society. So positive and negative cancels each other out. So as economists, we are not worrying about this, right? Because it's a positive, it's a negative, who cares? It's a transfer. When we introduce a Pigouvian tax, as in this example, we see different colors. We see consumer surpluses, everything below the demand curve above the price line, accruing to consumers, good stuff. They still have a benefit. Producers also have a benefit, less obviously than what they would have been enjoying at point R. Consumers are also losing out, of course, but who's gaining is the Chancellor of the Exchequer. Government gets money, right? And society is benefiting. Why? Because we get rid of the deadweight loss. So this is good stuff. The challenge is, of course, what? The challenge is that we need to determine the price for each and every unit of output, because the Pigouvian tax is different if you produce just 50 units, because the tax rate is then the difference between this point and that point. And if you produce more, the tax rate rises. And we were already discussing that it's insanely difficult to determine an adequate price of carbon, of 1 ton of CO2 emitted in the future. What is its environmental value that it should get? What is the price we should charge? And now we have to charge it for every time we go to the restaurant. That's insane. Can you imagine how a country with limited administrative capacity would implement that? Impossible, right? Can you imagine how a country with wonderful administrative capacity would seek to implement that? Completely impossible. Pigou is a wonderful theory that is, strictly speaking, for the birds, because it's not practical. But when you talk with the Ministry of Finance, they tell you, this is what we do. This is marvelous. Yes, I agree, it's marvelous, but they don't do that. What they do is this. This is a different form of tax called Baumol and Old tax or uniform tax. What it tells us is that we have, again, a price and a quantity. We have a downward sloping demand curve and a difference between private cost and social costs. The same story as a second before. But the uniform tax is different in the sense that Baumol and Olds tells us, well, if you are not able to determine the adequate price of each and every ton of CO2 that you are emitting, and hence you are unable to determine the Pigou tax for each and every action that you're undertaking in life, well, come up with an environmental standard. Try to determine how much you would like to reduce emissions or what the price would be at point M. Now try to set a standard where you think you have society better off and try to determine the costs for this quantity of output. Yes, madam.
Sorry, sir. I would like to clarify because I might have wrong understanding, but for the Pigouvian tax, does that mean that the cost of the emission, like for every ton of emissions, it actually fluctuates because and this one
basically
is
for each and every activity, for each and every ton of CO2, you will have a different tax rate.
oh, and that's why it's impractical.
Yes, very correct. Sorry. Collecting microphones. Wonderful. Oh, no, keep it. So you will participate again, yes? Good. Okay. So basically with the uniform tax, we just have the challenge to determine a standard that we think might be adequate. Does not need to be correct. If it's not correct, if we're underperforming, we increase the tax rate. Not a problem. But let's start somewhere. Let's put a tax and see what happens. How much we improve the environment. If it's too little, we increase it. If we need to reduce it, okay, we can reduce it, but at least we've tried, right? And the beautiful thing is that with a uniform tax rate, we just have a one tax rate for each and every ton of CO2 that is being emitted.
For the carbon tax, for example, for the gasoline,
Mhm.
in EU, for example, that's uniform tax, not Pigovian.
Everywhere.
Yeah, okay.
The ministries of finance always tell you, theory tells us that this is what we are doing. This is what they're doing. Because we have a uniform tax everywhere. We have a standard that has been set. It's called the tax rate, and it's applied for whatever activity you have. What is the result? It looks like this. We have the same effect in terms of consumer surplus, but we do have a marked difference in terms of producer surplus. It's now smaller. And it appears, at least in the graph as I was drawing it, is that we have double the size of income, tax revenue for the government. So government likes this. Consumers are not that much affected, but guess who does not like this system? Producers. They hate this. Why? Look how much consumer surplus has been nibbled away. Producer surplus has been nibbled away. The green area was this big and is now that small. They don't like taxes.
No one does.
No, indeed, nobody does. But tax, oh yes. If you could repeat for our guests online.
Is the standard cost an overestimate then?
It's not necessarily an overestimate. It's simply that the government needs to decide a particular tax rate. They estimate, they guess what might be adequate, and then they simply see what happens. And if they're right, fantastic. And if they need to adjust, they can adjust. What they try to do in a uniform tax is estimate the vertical distance between this point and that point, right? In our graph, it would be 20 euros, the tax rate. And if they think first it's 18 and they figure out they are wrong because there's still too much pollution, then they increase it to 20. And if they first thought it was 25, well, they have less output than is good for society and they can reduce the tax rate. So in Pigou, you need to be perfect. In the uniform tax rate, you can adjust, learning by doing. At least, that's the idea. And the logic with the Baumol-Olds tax is don't worry not to make it perfect, but get started. And that is, of course, also the game in climate change policy. If you can, do something. Good. So 30 more. Phew, good. So let us take a look at taxation. What do we know about Pigou, the proportional tax? Well, it leads to an increase in the marginal private cost of pollution through the tax, and it brings up the decision maker to recognize the societal costs. So we have a full internalization. We have a clear price signal. We thereby set abatement incentives, reduce the uncertainty for businesses, because they know whatever detriment they cause to society, they need to pay for. We create government revenue that can be used according to peers to reduce other distortive taxes, sort of the double dividend hypothesis. Tax bads, not goods. So that's a nice thing to reduce income tax, to reduce labor taxes. Fantastic ideas. We can adjust taxes flexibly. We can increase them or decrease them. Every year there's a period of time at the budget decisions when taxes are discussed. Even as time flies throughout the year, taxes can be adjusted. We know how this works. It's not that difficult. It's a simple decision by Parliament, and you have a different tax rate. You can do this. Interestingly enough, everybody needs to pay the same type of taxes. Incumbents and newcomers to a market, which is a point that might be different when we look at emissions trading systems. So that's why it's here. And importantly, PIGU taxes incentivize the implementation of new technology. Because if you have a technology that would get rid of the externality, you will implement it, provided that the implementation of the new technology is saving you money vis-a-vis having to pay a tax. As long as technology is cheaper than paying the tax, you want to use this new technology. Makes intuitive sense, right? And it gives us a kinked supply curve under the Piguvian tax, because for pollution that is where the tax for internalization is less than the technology, we prefer to pay the tax. And only at a certain point, the technology application will be cheaper. And that's when we start using new technology. So inherent in the Piguvian tax idea is the incentive for implementing new technology. And that is unfortunately not the case for uniform taxes. It can be if you are designing your uniform tax smartly, if you have the right tax base, if you have the right stick and carrot, so to speak. But if you mess up, if you have the wrong proxy in your fiscal package, you're not getting the results that you're hoping for. And what you want to achieve when we look at the challenge on climate change is we want to incentivize transition in the economy, because we unfortunately are now at a place where we need to think about how to get the world towards net zero, because we've been spending decades doing too little, too late. When we look at taxation, what is clear is that we don't know what is happening in terms of environmental effectiveness. What we're trying to do with setting a price for the environment in form of taxation is to incentivize the recognition that the environment is to be preserved and to get companies to move in this direction. Whether they will move, we don't know. We simply don't know how effective our tax rate will be. It depends on the industry, it depends on the markets, depends on the needs of the people, right? So environmental effectiveness is uncertain, but price is certain. Bear this in mind, because we will come back to this issue when we look at emissions trading, where we do know what the quantity, what the benefit for the environment will be, but not what the price will be. What is really important to notice is that the effectiveness of the tax rate will always depend on the demand and supply elasticity. So on the gradient of the respective curves. We will see this effect in a moment when we go a step further. What is also important to point out is that the uniform tax rate is incompatible with the idea of a Piguvian tax, because it's overcharging for environmental degradation, right? And it is not incentivizing to the same degree the implementation of new technology. So these complexities we need to bear in mind. Let us therefore take a look at John Dale's idea of emissions trading. Emissions trading is proliferating around the globe. Here we see where emissions trading has been implemented. In areas blue, they have emission trading systems. In areas dark green, it is underway. And in light green areas, it has been proposed. So we see a strong proliferation of emission trading systems being applied today. We also know countries where we have, at the same time, emissions trading and taxation in parallel. in the same sectors, but not necessarily for the same companies. So if you're caught under an ETS system, you may not be caught under a tax system, which is apparently different in Indonesia. So what is this emission trading systems? Well, in the absence of flexibility and incentives, it is often considered to be a disadvantage to use command and control, because command and control tells companies precisely what they should be doing and how. And that is a detriment of rulemaking. Rulemaking also requires the government to have a lot of information of how to design rules, what should be put down on paper. Now, as lawyers, you think like, oh, I know how to write a law. Sure. But if you get from the minister the task, you know, we have now problems in the area of agriculture and fertilizers. Please write me a law to regulate the application of fertilizers. Okay, how do you do this? It's somewhat complicated, right? Because suddenly it's not just about drafting a proper legal text. It's about knowledge of what these things, these liquids or pearls or whatever farmers are using for getting a better harvest, what they use in practice. And it may also be that a farmer does not only use one chemical, but several chemicals. So how do you regulate those? So it requires a lot of information that the government may or may not have. And more often, governments don't have this specific knowledge. Now, when we look at emissions trading, we have the same type of problem. Because how do you regulate which kind of processes a particular industry should be using? You may not be a specialist in all the abatement technology that is at the disposition and is affordable. Because ideally, as a policymaker, you don't want to destroy your own industry just as a caprice. No, trial and error with destruction and the livelihood of people is not fun, right? So that is a big challenge that we are facing. Now, how can we use emissions trading? Emissions trading is the idea that you are creating a tradable property right to emit 1 ton of CO2. Actually, 1 ton of CO2 equivalent, because you have 6 different types of greenhouse gases. So you need to determine how you're measuring them. And you make them tradable across covered entities, across polluters. That is what you would like to achieve. And the benefit is, of course, that the party with the lowest abatement cost will benefit the most because they can reduce emissions, sell allowances that they have been saving to others, and get paid. It's business, right? People in society like it because it does not sound like taxation. Taxes, everybody knows, gives us the goosebumps, right? Yeah. If you have to pay taxes, you're a student, so you might be lucky not to pay too many taxes, but once you get a decent income, government comes to you. They make sure that they get what they deserve. With emissions trading, people listen first because they don't know what it is and how it works. Then they hear it's a market, business, and governments want to have the place of the stock exchange because it promises income, right? So here we have a different approach, but markets are based on scarcity. So we need to have the right companies in that will be trading with each other. So ideally, we have different sectors that are forming part of this emissions trading system. Because if everybody is just in the cement industry, who on earth is buying and selling, right? So it's better to have a diverse portfolio of sectors with different abatement costs. Otherwise, you're not benefiting. But of course, for lawyers, for law and economics scholars, it's always easier to use comics to elucidate points made. Let us look at this. It looks initially somewhat complex, arguably. So let us look at the right picture at point A. We have here two important things. We have upward sloping marginal costs and downward sloping marginal benefits. Why do we have those? Well, why are benefits downward sloping? If you go out and eat a delicious dinner, the first plate is very delicious. The second one is still digestible, but once you're at the fifth, I'm not sure if you're enjoying yourself anymore, right? So basically, we have a downward sloping benefit from increased quantity. That makes intuitive sense, right? Why is it upward sloping the marginal costs? Well, if you would like to avoid costs to society, the more things you are avoiding, the more expensive it becomes. Let us think, for example, of homicides in society. A famous law and economist, Gary Becker, reminds us that the optimal number in society of homicides is positive. Why would this be? Basically, because for society, there will be an optimal point of the marginal benefits of avoiding homicides and the marginal costs of avoiding homicides. And that number will not be zero, but positive, because otherwise every second one of us would need to become a policeman. Rather costly, right? So, back to our topic and climate change. Here in this example, we start with an overall economy consisting of just two companies. Together, they produce 40 tons of CO2. We have marginal costs and we have marginal benefits. And let us assume that they are such that we need to reduce the overall pollution in our economy from 40 tons of CO2 to just 20. Okay, so now we know as the government, society is better off if we have overall pollution. Now, economists are, of course, lazy buggers. So what I'm sorry, I'm an economist. I'm allowed to complain. I'm also a lawyer, so I also complain in a moment about lawyers. But what we can do is we can use command and control. And if we are economists, lazy people, let us assume that we just have two companies. They are equal in size. They both are producing 20 tons of CO2. Tap, tap, tap in our pocket calculator, 2 times 20 is 40. Hence, we come back to our current pollution level. So how do we bring back pollution from 40 in our society to half? How do we do this? One approach would be to simply use command and control. We send from the ministry a love letter, command and control, and order the companies to halve their production, or at least halve their emissions. Important, emissions, not production, we are halving. That is an approach. It means that both firm A and firm B need to reduce their emissions from 20 to 10. Why not? We can do this. What would be the costs? Now it becomes interesting, because in our graph, we see that both companies A and B have different abatement cost structures. So on the right-hand side, graph B, we are reading from the right-hand side backwards. And the first ton of CO2 that we are abating is the cheapest, the low-hanging fruits. But the more we abate, the more expensive it will become. And what we see is the area in red are the costs accruing to company A from abating 10 tons of CO2. Firm B has it cheaper because they have lower abatement costs. The area that is green here is markedly smaller, and that is a good thing. because we see that there are differences in price. Okay, let's go one step further. Let's now assume we are not using command and control, but rely on emissions trading. So we are now creating tradable property rights equivalent to 1 ton of CO2 and simply allocate 20 tons to both companies. Let's assume that we simply give 10 tons of pollution away for free. Just like that. Companies get a permit and think like, oops, I have a problem. Because at the end of the fiscal year, I need to surrender. I need to account how much I was emitting. And I'm not allowed to emit unless I have 1 ton of CO2. If I don't have a permit, I'm not allowed to pollute. Otherwise, I will be fined. So I need to purchase 1 ton of CO2, the right to pollute somewhere. In this example, it needs to come from the other polluter. So A and B need to figure out how to trade 1 ton of CO2. How will they do this? Well, it will lead to an equalization of the marginal abatement costs. So basically, we see that company A will figure out that it is very expensive for it to reduce emissions. And it will ask company B, hey, don't you want to sell me your emission rights? And what we see is that the costs for company B will be lower than for company A, but at a certain point, we see that they're the same. And the overall costs of reducing emissions for B is much lower than for A, and that is what we see in this area. Because for A to reduce these additional 5 tons, the costs are like this, and for company B, it is much smaller. So we see that the green area of costs is smaller than the red one. And it is this difference between the two that makes emission trading so attractive, because we use the fact that abatement cost structures between companies, between industrial and energy generation sectors can be so different. And this is why it is important to have different sectors covered. If you only cover the same sector, you're not reaping the benefits. So what are then the advantages? Well, if we apply an emission trading system under a proper cap, we are ensuring, by definition, environmental effectiveness, because we are not allowed to pollute more than we introduce emission rights, emission permits. The size difference between the last green and the red area is dramatic. It's estimated 2.9 to 3.7 billion euros. So it's a sizable amount that we can save by using emission trading rather than command and control type of approaches. We also have an automatic adjustment to inflation, because we are not dealing with a price instrument, but with a quantity instrument, and leave it to the market to figure out what the prices should be, because they will be based on the respective abatement cost structures. We don't care about the prices because they will be automatic. Government does not need to come up with a number. They just need to fix the quantity.
Can I ask something about the previous
10
slide about the
minutes.
graph?
Yeah.
The previous slides. Why is the price of emission allowance higher if there is more abate, like for like 20 CO2? Lower, sorry.
So here we see what would it cost the company A to reduce 5 more tons. And here we see that the costs are for company A to reduce from 15 to 10 tons, to reduce 5 tons, is higher than what it would cost company B to reduce additional 5 tons.
Wait, sir, is the y-axis like is the top higher and then the bottom is lower? Okay, does it increase?
No, it's about the surface area, the size of the area. So the area here that is surrounded in red is bigger than in green, right? And the area represents the costs of reducing emissions, of abating emissions. And because this area, the red area, is bigger than the green one, it means that it's more expensive for company A to reduce emissions. And it's the difference in the costs that is creating the benefit for society. Because it's cheaper for company A to pay company B to do their homework, to reduce 5 tons of emissions for them, rather than to do it themselves.
Okay, thank you, sir. I just didn't understand about the price of emission allowances part, the y-axis, because
Yeah, the price of emission allowances in this example will be determined by this point and that point. Because it will be then based on what the average marginal abatement cost price is, and it will be the same for both companies.
but at 20 CO2, is the price emission allowance lower than at 5 CO2?
Yeah, if you just need to reduce by 5 tons, it will be cheaper than if you reduce 20 tons.
I mean, in the x-axis, the 20 is like lower on the point in the graph.
From 20, and then you
Yeah.
reduce the first 5 cheaper, then if you reduce more 5. So the way you go from the right to the left, then the price will be higher.
So, for example, here at this point, you just reduce 1 ton of CO2. But the second ton of CO2 will be more expensive that you avoid. If you want to avoid 20 tons, it will be really expensive.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's like studying for an exam. If you study 1 hour, you get a grade. If you study more time, you get a better grade. But if you want to be getting an A+ with a star, you probably need to invest substantially more time than a couple of hours or days. So the increment is getting more and more expensive.
You just need to find the magic number.
Yeah, but the magic number will be found by the market, because you will abate yourself unless it is cheaper to buy abatement on the market in forms of allowances. Let us go towards the disadvantages of emission allowances. Well, basically, you need a lot of data, and data is difficult to get by. Government does not know the data, hence it needs to get it from companies via measurements, and that is a big challenge. We also need to determine what the optimal level of emissions is. And we see, with respect to the EU ETS, that the European Union has been trying to catch up every couple of years, setting more and more ambitious targets. And what we also notice is that the prices of emission allowances will be quite volatile, because markets are inelastic. So markets react and prices react. And that is a big challenge that we have, because that is the variable that can change easily. And if prices are too low, we still have the environmental result, but we are not having the price high enough to actually force a transition. That is what we see in the European experience. So the transaction costs of introducing and operating an emission trading system will be high. It requires a lot of monitoring, verification, and reporting. We generally assume that it will only pay off for large emitters, and particularly when you're not just looking at energy inputs, but at process emissions, things are getting more and more difficult to measure and to estimate. a point that, because I'm told that we don't have that much time anymore, I'm afraid, that I want to make is elasticities. Here we have a very simple crisscross of price and demand. We all know how this works. And when we look at introducing a tax, we can choose where to levy this. And we can put the legal obligation to pay a tax at the producer or the consumer. You've seen those graphs. You know how this works. You have politicians that want to get elected by saying, oh, I will tax those companies. I don't tax you, I tax them. Do your politicians do this? Yeah, they just pass it on, no? But it gives them the votes, interestingly enough, because economically speaking, the legal incident of taxation has no effect whatsoever on the economic incident, right? Because what really counts is the shape of the curve. Because depending on who has the flatter curve will eventually, whomever has the most inelastic, the most steep curve, either demand or supply, will actually pay. And that is a big problem for the legislator, no? Because whether we are dealing with a quantity-based instrument or price-based instrument, elasticities play the fundamental role. And when we are taxing, for example, fossil fuels, energy, it is affecting the consumers. Because prices can be easily passed on. Can I have 3 minutes more? Good. In the European experience, we have had to determine whether we want to have a tax or an emission trading system. And before we even knew about emission trading systems, we wanted to use taxes. But in Europe, there's something called the European Commission. They wanted to use taxation, but the member states love their sovereignty, obviously, because they're nation states. And how do we get about this? By unanimity voting, meaning that all the member states in the European Union need to agree on something before it can happen. And in the area of taxation, we require unanimity voting. So unsurprisingly, it did not fly with some member states because we have member states that are firmly relying on specific economic energy-based preconditions. And as a consequence, we were thinking of introducing, then implementing the Kyoto Protocol via an emission trading system, not because we wanted to, but because reaching unanimity voting was not possible. It was not an option. So we have now the European emission trading system that was introduced in the beginning of 2005. It covers around 5,000 operators that together own around 12,000 installations in 4 broad sectors: energy, non-ferrous metals, minerals, pulp and paper. Later aviation was added, and they are working on maritime shipping to be included. So a lot of sectors, it operates in many different areas. But what I would like to point out is one thing that might be interesting for Indonesia related to allocation. And that comes back to the point of how national allocation plans are drafted. So we have the obligation for member states now in 2005 to implement a trading system. And we asked member states, so how much emission allowances do you want to give to your companies? Well, the problem that ensues is, of course, that you have companies that like their industry. Can we imagine that? Of course, right? You have some that read the law that feels their obligation towards mankind, obligation that they are entrusted with the nature, and you have those that just see business. Because if you allocate more allowances to your industry than other countries do, your guys are getting paid for selling paper money, right? Right, that's what we call beggar thy neighbor policy. So what was happening collectively is that member states were over allocating allowances somewhere, others were not. And as a consequence, we had an over allocation in period 1. And we see here that the market believed what the Commission initially said, that there should be a price of 30 euros per ton of CO2. And later, it was revealed that the market was oversupplied and long. Emission allowance markets only work well if there's scarcity. If everybody has more than they need, they don't care. Prices will be zero. So that's what we see here in the black line. Huh? That's the spot market. So from 30 euros per ton of CO2 up to 10 euro cents. No, in beginning, everybody thought that the market was functioning. People were believing the legislator. They asked the Commission, what do you think the price would be? The Commission said like, the market determines the price, but probably around 30 euros per ton of CO2. That's what you see here. That's what they said. That's what people believed. No. No, it's a market. Yes, it's a market perceived value. It moves up and down, right? And here we see in the black line that we are moving in one direction. Then the market was cautioned by the Commission because they got the data in and they thought like, there's something wrong. They figured out that the market was long. They cautioned the market, prices were halving, and then the market said, okay, now it's corrected. Once the actual data from the first trading, from the first compliance year was coming out, it was evident the market was completely long, oversupplied. And if there's more supply than demand, prices do like this.
Less regulated than the stock. They're like in stocks.
Yeah, it works different. It's in a way more regulated because it has a fixed supply. Supply is restricted by the government. No, price is volatile. The quantity is set. But if you give in such a market too more quantity than what is needed, prices drop because there's no banking in this market. So in the first trading period, it's all about the assets that are there. You cannot use the assets for anything else. So if you're not needing them, they don't have a price, right? Because there's simply nobody that wants them. Correct, right? So that was the first trading period. That was a learning by doing. So even in Europe, when you think like a lot of things, high administrative capacity, people know, no. Because you had governments, that were nice to their members, to their industry, and others not. Others were, for example, UK, they were parsimonious. But look at Germany and particularly Poland. They love their industry. They were oversupplying. And most of them were oversupplying. Correct. Yes. Free allocation.
Free allocation.
Yes.
It needs to be more regulated, like in the stock market.
Well, no, I would not want to compare to the stock market, but it needed to be corrected. It needed to be regulated differently. And the first trading period was a learning by doing period. And that was fine, because then we had the second allocation period, where the member states and the Commission had the data of the installations, knew what they were polluting in previous years, had the data there, and hence you could allocate according to what was needed. So in the first period, it was a government failure because of asymmetric information. They tried to do the best, but they failed. And politicians and the commission both thought that they really were hard bargainers. They were not, apparently. But for the second allocation period, everything was started anew. We now had the basis and good data. So now everything should be fine, right? What happens here? Economic crisis. Global economic output was dwindling. Here we have the US subprime crisis, 2008, hitting the real economy in Europe, 2009. Legislation was already passed. Everything was already finished for the next trading period. And hence we had over allocation. We see here building up over time. The effect of the economic crisis, 2008, 2009, would have been with us under the current system. The market impact on the emission trading system was so grave that the market was long till 2023, 24. So it would need like more than a decade to weed out this economic crisis alone.
Can you read the last part, sir?
Yes. If you have an economic downturn, you have less demand for
Stuff.
pollution rights because you pollute less, because you produce less, right? And that's a problem because what it means is that market prices are falling, which is good because at a time when your industry is having problems, you're not burdening them. It's an automatic stabilizer. So this is good, right?
It's what the market just wants at that sense.
That is what we want. That's what politicians love. But in this system, when you have a market downturn, you have the problem that you get your your environmental effectiveness cheaper at a lower price. Why is this a problem? It's beautiful, right? But if you want your economy to transition towards net zero, it does not transition.
It needs to be more expensive to reach that.
Correct. You need to kick the people to make investments. And here in this system, you get your environmental goals at zero cost or at very low costs. And that was a problem that we in Europe were working very, very long to weed out. So what we see here is a market failure at work because we were hoping that a carbon price would be such to incentivize transition. And obviously it didn't because the legislation was not allowing for addressing economic downturns. And who should have known that an economy can have an economic downturn? Well, there are huge bodies of literature with different economic waves, contrary waves every 30 years, every 20 years, every 8 years, every 4 years. The European Commission did not know. And with this thought, I would like to thank you for your kind attention and yield the microphone back to the chair.
Okay, thank you very much, Stefan. So perhaps we will have a pretty quick Q&A session. I hope it can accommodate everyone's questions. So perhaps we will prioritize one question from the Zoom meeting first, and then I will give the opportunity to the floor to also raise a question. So there's a question from, sorry, what's the name here? From Dupuy, I don't know whether he's gentlemen or ladies. So here's the question. What are the best practices to ensure that an emission trading system can operate efficiently, given that it requires a deep understanding of a company's potential carbon emissions and assumes that each actor complies with its emission permits. And in practice, how is the law enforced within the ETS if a company does not comply with its emission quota? I think it's already addressed, but perhaps.
Let me try to explain the last part. How does a company comply? Like basically in the EU ETS, like the European Emission Trading System, every year you need to submit a report and you need to surrender the right amount of allowances to the government. Either you've been getting them for free, like now we are increasingly selling allowances at auction for specific industries, we do that. Others are still getting allowances for free, but in the first trading period and the second, the vast majority of allowances were allocated for free. So basically, if you don't own enough allowances because you're polluting more than the quota that you've been getting, well, you need to go to the market and purchase them from other polluters. That's the beauty of it, right? So you simply go to somebody, ask, hey, do you have? I would like to purchase. In the beginning was a lot of over-the-counter transactions, calling around in the industry, trying to find a trading partner, but now everything is via energy exchanges, sort of stock exchanges, but very efficient. So everything is now happening on the basis of spot prices or even future trading in the industry.
Okay.
And how do you ensure that the market operates properly? Well, via monitoring, reporting, and verification procedures that are very complex and expensive. And that is why the literature suggests that it's a game that is really for big polluters, while compliance traders, they don't really have that much of a benefit. And small, medium-sized enterprises, they are not able to meet the costs of an emission trading system. For them, taxation is cheaper.
Okay, I hope that addresses. Yeah, so one more question from the audience. Okay.
Just a quick response to the last, to your statement about how the system works under the ETS. My question is, what happened to a company that fails to meet the quota?
Oh, it's actually, even in the first trading phase, we had a company that did this and they needed to pay a fine.
So there's a fine.
It's now a fine plus the obligation to surrender the missing allowances.
Okay, so there's a kind of administrative sanction.
Yeah, but it was an expensive one.
Yeah, very expensive.
So everybody, so compliance under the ETS, like at least in the beginning, when I was looking into this data, was almost perfect. Only a stupid person was miscalculating. So it was an error of stupidity, not of voluntary.
So in Indonesian system,
yeah,
instead of paying fine, the company will have to pay tax.
which
Of
is
course.
which sounds similar to an economic cost.
Yeah.
But the difference is that if you are under a cap and trade system, wanting to have environmental effectiveness, this does not work, because at a certain point in time, you are trading the price for environmental certainty.
Yeah.
Which is a possibility, but then you might achieve the same with a tax at a cheaper price level.
Yeah. For example, here the tax price is around 30,000 rupiah, and the price of the credits allowance is around 70,000.
17?
70. 70.
Yeah.
70,000. So
Yeah.
it means that for company,
they
cheaper
just pay the
pay
tax.
tax. Yeah.
Yeah. Which basically means that you are back to a price floor of a carbon tax, and you don't have any incentive to go beyond.
Yeah.
So you have a very expensive monitoring, reporting, verification system that you don't need. We should complain about this.
I have one more question.
permission to ask a very simple question. First and foremost, thank you, Mr. Stefan, for the lecture. I believe this is a very elementary question, but I feel like this is necessary to. I can't happen to paint the picture or the end game towards carbon taxing. And here I wrote down in my notes, through carbon tax, you incentivize the polluters from polluting emissions. But yet people will still pollute because, as Michael Fowler said, by halting emissions, you will kill your own economy. And so that brings me to my question. What happens to the tax retrieved through carbon taxes? What will the government do with the tax, and how will it contribute to the well-being of the environment?
Okay. What Michael says is generally correct. However, if we look in a practical example, if we do some number crunching, as colleagues of ours have been doing at the OECD regarding the impact of the EUTS on the competitiveness of the industry in Europe, you might be surprised that actually the EUTS has not had any negative effect whatsoever on competitiveness of European companies. Which is, shall we say, counterintuitive. Why is that? It is because companies are either able to pass on costs to consumers, or they are awarded free allowances from the system. Because the energy generators are paying basically everything that they need. They are purchasing every ounce they need at auction. But on the other side, the industry is subject to specific support schemes under energy-intensive trade-exposed or energy-intensive trade-exposed industry is receiving free allowances. And you may ask, and who are those industries that are energy-intensive and trade-exposed? Merely 98% of all the covered industrial enterprises. Now, we know in Europe that this is not good, right? Because if you want to reduce, they need to do something. So now we've been really cracking down on this. We've been reducing tremendously the numbers of sectors and industries, the industrial numbering system, like the NCE systems, we've been reducing the numbers dramatically. So now only 94% of all industry is energy intensive and trades exposed. That is why we have the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanisms, to help us out. Because when you look at where are the emission reductions coming from in Europe, they're basically, no, not from outside, they're from energy. Energy is reducing dramatically. Industry is more or less keeping its absolute emissions straight, which means that they are getting more efficient because they're producing more than 20 years ago. So they are reducing in relative terms, but not in absolute terms. Which means if you want to get to net zero, you need to start running. Because thus far, industry has not been making the transition. They've not been reducing. And this is the challenge we have. And indeed, Michael Fowler is correct. We need to reduce emissions. We need to reduce the quantity of emissions that we produce that will be associated with productivity. We will pay a higher price. Nobody will be happy, but we will be better off. So thinking of your dessert, I would be very proud if you're able to explain this to your parents and make them happy.
Okay. I'd love to hear a question, but we don't have more time to address all the questions. Thank you very much, Professor Stefan. It was really
Thank you very much for allowing me to be here and to talk about my hobby horse. thank you very much for welcoming us. Thank you very much for hosting so brilliantly. And my apologies that I was being more talkative than I should have been.
No.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everyone. So we'll have a little gift to you. Perhaps Professor Andrew can give you just sort of a ceremonial thing here in Indonesia. So perhaps.
You take the picture.
Yeah, I will take the picture. And you please. Okay. 1, 2, 3. Okay. So just to wrap up all the things, can you please guys stand up and then we'll take a picture, nice picture from here. It's all right. You can just stay here and then Professor Stefan will be here. Okay, so we make sure everyone is visible.
If you have that.
Sini, Gap, dari sini, dari sini. Foto dari sini. Fotonya nanti kita ganti terus. Okay. Can stand there.
It is in the behind the. Okay. Okay. Everyone, smile. Every 1, 2, or more. 1. Perfect. Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you ya. Seru bro. Seru ya. Seru bro. Nanti saya.
So everyone, thank you for attending, and also those who are from the Zoom meeting, thank you very much. I will see you, and we'll see you on the next occasion and next meeting. Thank you. Terima kasih semuanya.